Hi, I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute. Happy to welcome you all here today for this conversation. Common Core, what's next for school systems? Common Core at this point has been adopted by 45 states and the District of Columbia. Much of the conversation around the country the last couple of years has either been robust enthusiasm for the notion that these K-12 reading and math standards really have the opportunity to improve the caliber of instruction and assessment. There has also been, especially in, say, the last 12 to 18 months, a rising chorus of skepticism, concerns about some of the ways in which these reading and math standards are going to impact instruction. What we're going to talk about less today is whether the Common Core standards are good or bad. The reason is my own personal bias is I think most efforts to alter standards or instruction or curriculum or assessment turn as much on how they are done and what they do as on any grand designs sketched on the front end. I could be wrong on this. I'm frequently wrong about things, but that's the bias that I'm coming from, and that's the bias that's going to inform today's conversation. So what we really want to talk about today with key superintendents, Joanne Weiss, who's at the middle of so many reform conversations at the U.S. Department of Education, Dave Coleman at the College Board, who played an instrumental role in shaping the Common Core standards, is what are some of the challenges ahead as states and school systems really seek to make these things deliver on their promise, and what are opportunities for other actors, for researchers, for advocacy groups, for providers to help solve some of these challenges that loom ahead. That's going to be the conversation. Before I go ahead and introduce the panel and get started, just a couple other quick thoughts. One, please go ahead and turn your cell phones to silent. Second, the event is being live tweeted. For those of you with us here or watching either online or on C-SPAN 1, if you want to join the conversation, go ahead and use the hashtag Next4CC. That's hashtag Next, N-E-X-T, F-O-R, capital CC. We've got a couple upcoming events here that you may want to join us for. On January 15th at AEI, I'm giving a Bradley lecture titled Why Fixing Education Isn't Enough, The Culture of Can't in K-12. And also in mid-March, we're having one of our major all-day research conferences titled Common Core Meets the School Reform Agenda, trying to take a look at how some of these tensions are going to unfold over the next few years. Anyway, for today's conversation, I'm delighted to have with us 5 folks who are in the middle of this stuff, living and breathing it. We have Dr. Eric Beacoats, Superintendent of the Durham Public Schools. Previously, Eric was an administrator in Guilford County, North Carolina, Charlotte-Mecklenburg, North Carolina, and he was most recently the National Alliance of Black School Educators Superintendent of the Year. We also have with us Liz Fagan. Liz is a superintendent of Douglas County School District. Douglas County is Colorado's 3rd largest school district with about 60,000 kids. Previously, Liz was superintendent of Tucson Unified in Arizona. And under Liz's leadership, the district has been heralded as a beacon of education reform by none less than U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. Third with us, David Coleman, President and CEO of the College Board. David co-founded Student Achievement Partners and played a leading role in the development of the Common Core standards. In 2011, he was recognized as one of Time Magazine's 11 education activists for 2011. In 2012, he was New School Venture Fund's Change Agent of the Year, so we'll see what he is in 2013. You set a high bar, always a mistake. Next to David is John Daisy. John, superintendent of the Los Angeles Unified Public Schools, 2nd largest system in the country, educating 800,000 students. Previously, John served as Deputy Director of Education for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he led their work on effective teaching. And before that, to those folks who are local to Washington, he's remembered as the hard-charging superintendent of the Prince George's County Schools. And finally with us, we have Joanne Weiss, Chief of Staff to the U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan. Prior to that, she may have had the toughest job in the Obama administration. She ran the much-discussed $4.5 billion Race to the Top program, getting that off to a widely heralded start. And before joining the administration, Joanne was partner and chief operating officer at the New Schools Venture Fund. With that, guys, let's go ahead and get this started. John, Los Angeles is wrestling with any number of challenges. You've made it clear that you think achievement has to go up. There's concerns about some of the fraught politics of school reform. Where does Common Core sit in all of this? Does this make your life easier or harder? Where does it intersect with these conversations about teacher evaluation and school improvement?
For me, I think it makes life much easier. It's dead center in terms of all of these pieces. It's on. I'll talk louder, but it is on. So for me, it makes life much easier because it anchors the work that we're doing, and it is dead center in the conversations about how to create balanced and appropriate accountability systems, how to shape the work of instruction, but particularly for language learners. So I think all the things that you mentioned in terms of evaluation and future things, especially around the distribution of resources, I think all get helped in having the Common Core be an anchor. That doesn't say that there aren't a number of very, very important and significant dilemmas that are facing us almost immediately around this issue. I suspect we'll talk about that in a moment. But at the end of the day, it help.
Go ahead and flag a couple of those that you're wrestling with.
So I think that this affects us in a couple of ways. There's an orientation dilemma. That is, how does the system orient itself from kind of previously very top-down, very kind of results-driven to where I think the quality of instruction is actually going to emerge as the leadership issue in the system, as opposed to other leadership issues we've had where it's either been driven by accountability or it's been driven by lack or distribution of resources. So I think this orientation to instruction as the lead is definitely one of the pieces that we need to transition to. Technology is another major dilemma. And it's not just as simple as students having a device. It's how does that actually, because that, will be a definite part of assessment, but that will never work unless it is an integral part of instruction. And all the materials that need to go with that. And we need to have a conversation about that very, very quickly in terms of that piece. Pedagogy is a third issue. We're just about to enter a very different world. How to teach, how to help students learn. We're doing that in a world of collective work with students. And then lastly, this orientation towards assessment and how accountability will work itself into those. So those four pieces are huge. They have implications for teacher training. They have implications for professional development. They have implications for the distribution of resources in a world where there are literally thousands of vendor and products that are cropping up. And I'm going to make a plea today for some educational version of Consumer Reports around the quality of these products, their alignment, their rigor, and particularly for groups of students that we work with who are language learners, special education, etc. My own world, of course, is much larger in those areas, but I can't imagine that doesn't affect us across the country.
Eric, specifically on this question of instruction and pedagogy, and how teachers are going to succeed under the Common Core standards. In Durham, you've been pushing, your implementation plan is called Crossing the Bridge to the Common Core. Mm-hmm. And a big piece of this has been precisely the question of how do you train and support your educators. Could you talk a bit about what this involves? What are the costs? What are some of the early challenges that you've been wrestling with as you've tackled this?
Well, one of the challenges obviously is, or has been, the Board of Education, meaning bringing them along with us. We have had several board members who weren't necessarily on board with Common Core and us implementing it. However, we proceeded with our Crossing the Bridge training, and it was basically 5 days of training throughout this first school year, which was 2011-12. This is our first year of implementation. So we had to make sure that teachers first understood what is Common Core, so we took them slowly through that process. And I will say that we did have some teachers who were really go-getters, and they were out there and they were helping us to lead some of those efforts. Some of the other things that we have also done this school year is we've transitioned into is the what. We told you before about what it is, but this is now more of the how. You know the what, so how do you go about doing it? And so we've tried to make sure that we pull teachers along. We have utilized other resources such as the International Center for Leadership and Education. We've also utilized Discovery Clips. We've utilized other resources to help our teachers understand these are some tools that you can utilize. One of the challenges that we've had is the time, making sure that people felt as though that they were ready to do and move forward with the implementation. What we've been able to help teachers understand in a lot of instances is that there already are resources out there to help you. It's not necessarily that this is something that's totally new. Some of the standards already existed in the state of North Carolina, but it may be that you have to do it a different way. So we tried to do some modeling and coaching and helping them along. And I will say to you that it is a work in progress. It's not perfect, but I think that we are making progress, and I love the fact that we do have consistency across the board. That's the great thing.
And now, one of the things that routinely comes up when districts pursue reform is any teacher who's been around 5 years has already been through 2 waves, 3 waves, and they're like, Lord, here we go again. How do you wrestle with this? How do you convince teachers that this is actually something that they should take seriously and really start to rethink their approach to instruction?
Well, I think, one, you to look at some of the data, and in instances in where you see that children are not really hitting the bar. In the state of North Carolina, we have what you call a 4-level system in which you have students who are level 1, 2, 3, or 4. Significant number of students are not at that high level, so this is a way for us to really embed the rigor and the relevance, and what are we going to do differently. I think you also have to help teachers understand that you don't always have to be the director. You may need to be the facilitator. And then how do you help children then facilitate some of their learning, because you don't have to be the one talking down to them. How do we facilitate that learning? And then the other thing is the use of technology. We cannot be scared of utilizing technology or integrating it into what you're doing on a daily basis. It is not a standalone. It should be something that students are doing. And then the other thing that we've done is we've utilized teachers who get it, so we are utilizing them to help other teachers move them along. So those are some of the things that we've done.
I want to build on that for a second. I think that is spot on. Certainly have been other issues of improvement and reform. What is interestingly unique about this work is that this one is actually anchored into the classroom. And so teachers are going to lead this one, as opposed to kind of other pieces that they may have been involved in, but certainly were not centered at the classroom practice. The practice...
For instance, just give folks, what's an example of the other kind?
Accountability reform came to you. I think other reforms in instruction were direct instruction, and so whole scripted instruction was kind of sent, and this is how we're going to do things at 9:30 in the morning across the district, etc. The fact that practice will lead this has put teachers in, I think, a very appropriate center of this work, spotlight around this work. And your point of where it is catching fire, so to speak, is in letting us see the best work inside the classroom and having teachers lead the rest of us in the development of this work. And that actually has been incredibly engaging. The ability to use videography around instruction anchored in the Common Core has been incredibly powerful to date so far in terms of professional development.
Liz, the demographics of Douglas County are interesting for a reform district. You're one of the, perhaps the only district that's really heralded as reform-minded, with as affluent a population as you have, and that tends to perform as high relative to peer districts in the state. So I'm curious, in a high-achieving suburban district, what are the dynamics? What do you find in terms of parental responsiveness to the Common Core? How are your teachers taking it? And particularly given some of your other efforts to try to re-engineer teaching roles, how does Common Core implementation play in?
Well, it's such a complicated situation, but one thing that we've done in Douglas County is we haven't said, oh, we're just going to work on the Common Core, because I think that's been one of the failures of a lot of the reasons why teachers are a little bit jaded against change, because if you do it in isolation, it does feel like kind of one more thing. And so what we've done is we've said, look, we all agree in Douglas County, parents, teachers, students, everyone, that education needs to sort of reinvent itself for the 21st century, that we have this need for our students to be prepared differently and for them to be prepared to be, the most creative people on the planet when they graduate. And so as part of that, we have brought Common Core into that whole picture and said, how does this fit into the tomorrow that we need? And this is, we're not saying, you need to do this because of the Common Core. Instead, we're saying, we bring our teachers together and say, what should kindergarten look like tomorrow? And then the Common Core is definitely one thing that we use and reference in that work. But we actually work to take it to what we call level 2.0, and even our teachers push it beyond the rigor that it sets, and aligns it to what we believe our students really need tomorrow, and what our parents tell us, and what we actually have teachers who go out and look at the websites, the hiring sites of some of America's most interesting companies, and say, what are they looking for? And when you rewrite your curriculum for kindergarten and you include the concepts in the Common Core, how do you then align it to what Nike says they want? They want people who obliterate boundaries. I mean, is that what you're doing? Are you preparing people to obliterate boundaries? And so we've taken this as sort of part of a systemic change or a comprehensive plan for reinvention of education, and included the Common Core as part of that, which once we have defined exactly what it is we think all kids should be able to do, then the next step is obviously how do you assess that? And so as our teachers build out this new sort of curriculum, if you will, then we move to the next step of writing assessments, interim assessments, formative, summative assessments that actually measure those things that we believe are most important for our students. So, and then we take it, and as our system flows, then it goes on to how do you instruct that way, and ultimately, how do you show the highest levels of growth and achievement for students on these important outcomes. And in Douglas County, we link that to the performance of our teachers, which impacts their compensation.
David, one of the issues that has cropped up in the last couple months is this question of the recommended emphasis on informational texts in the English language arts standards. You could say a bit more about it, but I think in broad strokes, the Common Core recommends that about half of what students read at K-8 be informational text, newspapers, nonfiction, and such. And in high school, that it's closer to 70% of what they read. And you've pointed out that this is not in their English language arts classes, but this is across the school curriculum. Now, one of the concerns that I've heard voiced by skeptics, but also by some educators, is, gosh, it's the English teachers under accountability systems who are on the firing line for whether kids are demonstrating mastery of the ELA piece of the Common Core. Are they going to feel pressed to squeeze fiction out of the curriculum in order to make sure they're covering the requisite informational text? How does this stuff start to work through as districts take the standards from the abstract and put them into play?
Let me begin with some facts about the role of literature and literary nonfiction and nonfiction, the Common Core standards, just to state what the standards say so we can start from there. But before I do that, I think there was a bigger idea percolating, Rick, and I don't want to get pulled down here before I talk about something that was so striking in this conversation. While there isn't a teacher on this panel, which is a shame in a way, the voice of teachers is strong here. Each superintendent that spoke in different ways talked about connecting to teacher leadership. Yours, you said teachers took the lead when you did the training. John was talking about not done to them, but taking lead on this. David Sherman's here working on Share My Lesson from AFT. There's a very exciting thing going on in this country. There's the Core Task Project in Nevada. Teachers are making beautiful things and sharing them across state lines, and they are becoming the consumer reports quality that you are talking about, and it is exciting. Carol Jago, who is the great former president of the National Council of Teachers of English, wrote a gorgeous
English teacher at Santa Monica High School.
And English teacher in Santa Monica High School, wrote a more beautiful account of this question of the vibrant role of literature and literary nonfiction in the standards than I can speak. So Valerie Strauss published it today. Please read it. It's thoughtful, it's beautiful. This is a 30-year educator talking about these standards as a tool in her hand to do great work. Look at Hallie Booth's article as a science teacher about the opportunity to bring richer text to bear and richer sources for his kids to learn science. The voice of teachers, in my judgment, is the true triumphant voice here. To return to the Beltway and certain distortions that happen within it, let's go to the facts of the standards. In the earliest grades, in kindergarten through 5th grade in this country, what happened when you talk about accountability and narrowing is that because we only assessed reading and mathematics, reading sometimes would narrow, and the elementary school would narrow its curriculum to think it could just read some stories and fiction, and because that was what was thought of as reading, and then it would do mathematics, and guess what happened to history, science, and the arts in the elementary school? The Common Core standards in kindergarten through 5th grade, that's where they ask for a 50-50 balance where kids read richly in literature and the patterns of myth, learning from the great standards of Massachusetts, which David Driscoll led the development of, who's sitting here in front of me. There is knowledge of literature, to be clear, in early grades, patterns of myth and story and classic myth, and those are learned. But 50% of the time in elementary school is now dedicated to history, science, and the arts. We are restoring the right and obligation of elementary school teachers to be the guide to the world for their students. We are unnarrowing the curriculum. Reading and writing are the tools of knowledge, and with them students gain a knowledge in the earliest grades of literature and equally a knowledge of science, history, and the arts. That, to me, is work worth doing. In later grades, in 6th through 12th grade, in English language arts, fiction remains the focus of the English language arts classroom. Sentimental folks, and like me, I happen to take a course in Shakespeare where I read every play. 2 out of 10 of the 11th and 12th grade literature standards require the treatment of the bard. American literature is required. Do not fear for Huckleberry Finn and the Great Gatsby. They are specifically recommended in these standards as high-quality literature worth reading. The shift in English language arts is some entry of very high-quality literary nonfiction, as Carol Jago writes about beautifully today. What examples do we give in these standards? The founding documents and the Great Conversation. These, of course, can be treated in history classrooms as well, but in an English language arts environment, we study them as triumphs of thought and rhetoric, of word and action combined, not merely as historical events, but as a triumph of the English language at its most effective and most beautiful. This is the shift in English language arts, and one that everyday teachers are finding extremely exciting. How did it happen, because you asked about accountability, that these standards are not just English language arts standards, but also standards to hold accountable history and science teachers equally for the college and career literacy of their children? The first statement I will make is in both assessment consortia and the assessments being designed in these standards, they are not merely English language arts assessments. They are academic literacy assessments that will equally measure in later grades students' command of literary text, literature, literary nonfiction, but also to read and analyze scientific source material and historical primary and secondary documents. So the assessment is, for the first time, thank goodness, following the demand. But I have an interesting point of history for you folks. There was an organization that demanded that not only English language arts teachers, but history and science and social science teachers and technical teachers were equally accountable for their students' literacy and success. May I do an interactive thing? Does anyone want to guess what institution in our society insisted on greater teacher accountability for those results? The American Federation of Teachers. And David's here, and I congratulate them. And so when you talk about accountability and tough-mindedness, it was teachers who called for that accountability, period.
Terrific, David. Elegant. Eric, one of the issues that, if one takes the implication of what David just sketched out, is that teachers are going to be, outside of traditional tested subjects, reading and math, one can imagine value added, a la what Florida's doing under 736. How do you actually start to implement Common Core in a district at the same time thinking about the accountability systems that are going to be held up and put in place for teachers in subjects and domains that have not historically been tested?
Well, that is a challenge that we're facing right now in our state. So what we're basically doing this year is that this will be the year that we are basically setting that baseline. There are lots of discussions, obviously, with teachers stating that, that it's impacting their ability to do what they need to do effectively. There's a lot of debate in reference to whether or not you should utilize a test score to validate whether or not a teacher is effective. And I feel as though that's one of the ways that you measure a teacher's effectiveness, not the only way. But what we are trying to do basically is make sure that our teachers understand the standards. We make sure that we have an assessment system that is aligned to them, and then we will continue to modify and adjust the data as we move forward. But right now, we're actually in the designing phase process, and we will develop that baseline later this year once we get our data back.
Joanne, what role is the federal government playing in any of this? You know, obviously there's a number of political issues and there's tensions that arise up. So one, just how are you guys thinking as you watch the Common Core implementation proceed across the country? What's the appropriate federal role?
So I think when we came in and looked at the impact that No Child Left Behind was having, it was having exactly the opposite impact that I think all of us up here would want. It was incenting people to dumb down their standards, dumb down their tests, and lower the standards for all of their students. And when we started looking at what we could do about this, I think our job is to both enable quality and to create conditions under which the right incentives are happening. Incentives to have higher standards, a higher bar, to teach to a higher level, to have accountability that matters right at the juncture of kids, classrooms, learning, and to sort of help us reframe practice in this profession as being driven by how students are actually doing in classrooms.
So as you hear the superintendents talk about some of the challenges they're wrestling with, is there a role in some of that for the Department of Ed? Is it something that the Department of Ed is best not getting involved with? How do y'all think about the next 4 years?
I think we have, I think there's places that we can play roles. Clearly, the action is in classrooms and schools. That's where the leadership for this needs to come from. That's where the innovations will come from. That's where the breakthroughs in practice will come from. I think our job is to reframe, starting with ourselves at the Department of Education, from a compliance-driven sort of bureaucracy that's saying, did you get me the right reports and check the right boxes, to an organization that's much more focused on, first of all, outcomes, and are we achieving the goals that we want to achieve? And second, support, helping people achieve those goals. So things like communities of practice that I think we're trying to do across states, that states are trying to do across districts, that districts are trying to do across schools, schools are trying to do with professional learning communities across their teachers. These are really important. When we don't know what the right answers are, getting professionals who are engaged in this work every day together to co-create solutions is a huge, huge lever for change. And I think it's all of our jobs to start thinking about those kinds of roles, which are traditionally not the roles that, you know, state education agencies, the federal government, or even many districts have played. And I think we all have to step up our game and do things differently.
So one challenge that arises for states is, obviously by design, the Common Core is something that's intended to impact all children across the state. Now, current federal funding rules, especially around Title I, supplement, not supplant, and maintenance of effort, try to make sure that federal dollars under Title I are focused on students of high need. And so one of the challenges that has come up as states have moved forward under Ed Flex, for instance, is the question of whether they can actually use Title I dollars for implementation of Common Core, for professional training and assessment, given that it's obviously affecting all children and not just high needs children. Is this something the department is looking at? Is this something that the lawyers are taking under advisement? Is that not on the radar at this point? How do we think about altering some of the older rules as states wrestle with these challenges?
So let's remember that supplement, not supplant, is a really important thing to make sure that states and localities form the core of the funding for education in this country, and that what the federal government is doing with its dollars is making sure that the most disadvantaged students, whether that's low-income students, students with disabilities, English learners, are getting extra resources on top of that to help schools. Now, you know, a lot of schools in this country are Title I schools. Title I schools can use their funds in any way they see fit across the school to make sure that all of the professional development is done, the curriculum materials that they choose to buy are used for students. So I think already there's a tremendous amount of flexibility that the vast majority of states have and schools have in how they use the federal funds. The other thing that the states that have waivers have is that 20% of the Title I funds that used to be completely tied up in very prescriptive things like SES and choice now are completely freed up. 20%. I mean, this is a huge amount of money coming back into classrooms to use in whatever ways those teachers and principals and superintendents see fit to provide instruction for their students.
So, and just to push just a teeny bit further on this, so one thing some attorneys who work with districts have raised is, your point is exactly right, that obviously Title I schools can use those dollars for professional development or what have you. But if, for instance, it's professional development related to Common Core, and all schools in a district need that professional development, there's concerns that you can't use Title I dollars to do that in Title I schools, because then it's not something extra. It's something that other dollars are paying for elsewhere. So, they're just...
So rather than get into the specifics of a case, I will say that people can email me and I will get them in touch with the right lawyers to figure out the answer to the question. But our goal, we all have the same goal here, which is to have well-trained professionals in the classroom at this moment in time when there's a lot of things changing under them and they need the support and the training.
David?
I think just visually, I should say that the most remarkable thing about the Common Core is that the action is so radically state-led and at the state level. So while the federal government does play this enabling and thoughtful quality, what really is remarkable, people wonder, was it really state-led or did Washington do it? Well, let me tell you something. Let me tell you about a fairy tale about a different country that is not in Washington, where Republicans and Democrats work together to solve problems. It is simply inconceivable that Washington, forgive me, could have created the Common Core. Because what happened in the Common Core is Democratic and Republican governors got together, and their chiefs, and both unions, I might add, working together for higher accountability and more demand for their students, that is NEA and AFT, strongly together, to work together to say, hey, we're going to put aside our state differences, we're going to work together, and then you could say, oh, well, and I want to answer the criticisms, oh, well, it was because the incentive program of Race to the Top, and that was the only reason that people did this. Well, first of all, they've got a problem in Mitch Daniels, because Mitch Daniels refused, the Republican governor of Indiana, to participate in Race to the Top, but nonetheless adopted the core standard. Oops. Right? So this is a really interesting moment, guys. I want to just shed for a moment the typical frames we have in our mind, because the vitality of state engagement. David Driscoll was with me so many times in Massachusetts. State-led is a painful thing, my friends. It's not simple when you've got 46 diverse environments coming together to do something in common. But that changes some of the economics in profound ways. So the possibility of sharing a good thing made in Nevada for free with other teachers, these economics, so when you talk about sharing things in common, once you've made something beautiful for ELL students, whatever funds you've used that is now open source, it can be shared widely, and that sharing is emerging in shocking ways. Lynn Munson has done some beautiful work on curriculum maps that are being shared like hotcakes. It's an interesting time. So I think that I just want to remind people of...
One question. So in this, as we talk about the sharing and the teaching and the professional development, obviously teacher preparation sits in important ways here. What's the role of the teacher colleges here? What do we need from them? And John?
No, David, he asked you. Why don't you start?
I think there are a couple of things about teacher knowledge. I want to step back from teacher colleges and talk about teacher knowledge. It is hackneyed, and it is a refrain in this country to say, our teachers need to know the mathematics in order to teach the mathematics. And then we can say, and our teachers don't know enough mathematics, and we go down this path of learned helplessness and despair. Let me tell you what is so exciting. The great idea of these math standards is that in high-performing countries, there are far fewer topics explored in great depth. In K2, in high-performing countries, it is only the addition and subtraction of whole numbers and the quantities they measure. In 3rd through 5th grade in these common standards, 80% of the focus, multiplication and division enter the picture, and the mighty art of fractions that most predicts your ability to progress in the future. Why do I focus on this for teacher knowledge? Because we've changed the game, folks. Teachers can gradually, for the first time, they have time to learn, time to practice with their kids. Kids have more time to practice. So the first thing we have to do before we jump into redefining teacher education is take full advantage of the ability to learn on the job, to master a smaller body of material by mathematics used to be a race to cover topics, which was the enemy of depth. And David began to fight this in Massachusetts by making core things more important and shaping instruction that way. The Common Core is on steroids of dare to focus on few things that matter.
Okay,
So
and
that's
David,
the start.
let me push you on the teacher college question. And also, I mean, there's also, when we talk about teacher training and support, I mean, we're placing a lot of emphasis, obviously, in professional development. And it was the Institute of Education Sciences major report about 5 years back, which found that more than 90% of studies in professional development have found no impact on teacher effectiveness. So is it that the Common Core, by reducing the number of topics, is likely to be a game changer in the quality of professional development? Or do we also need to pay attention to improving the kind of professional development that districts are using?
I'll let the practitioner speak and I'll say something.
Well, from our perspective, we believe that professional development needs to happen in the school, in the classroom. It's not that you bring teachers out, you give them 5 or 15 or 35 minutes of something, and then you send them back into the classroom. So what we've basically done is we've tried to spend more time on professional learning, and that's what we entitle in professional learning, to make sure that our teachers clearly understand what it is that we're expecting for them to do. And again, I want to go back to utilizing the teachers. I think teachers learn best from teachers. Utilize the expert teachers that you have in your district. In English language arts, we now have what we call literacy leaders in our district across all subject matters. So we're giving these teachers the ability to go out, model in other classrooms, and help other teachers become better at their craft. But what it is, the main thing is that we're spending more time on task to make sure that teachers really get it, and we're going to the schools to actually provide them with the resources that they need, not bring them out of the classroom.
And is this...
Yeah, can I build on that?
Oh, go ahead, John.
So I actually think this, I want to drill on the notion of part of your question around the role of the academy and all of this. So this is not a helpful conversation around criticism and that they're not prepared and that they're not doing that. That actually doesn't advance the conversation. I think David makes the point of there's a unique moment of invitation for transformation here about how this work takes place. I think that's exactly what we're going to see, and this is a moment to shift the entire notion of practice and preparation for teaching to a much more clinical-based model inside of schools. And so the opportunity to prepare new teachers and to continually help existing teachers is going to be centered, I think, in the classroom and in the school, and not necessarily physically at the academy. We are not going to be able to do this one alone. I mean, we have 36,000 teachers. The thought that on the budgets we get in California, that is just simply not going to happen. We need the academy and teacher preparation colleges and universities to strongly partner with us, next to us. The idea that we're going to be able to send people out for this kind of inoculatory training is simply not going to work. And it will be based out of watching some of the best practice emerge. My only problem is it needs to happen yesterday. And so the ability for folks to rapidly transform this work, aligned inside of the work of schools and side by side, is probably up there with good material and technology last week. So I am concerned, but I think the opportunity to be a strong partner in that is going to be critical.
How much confidence do you have that faculty at colleges of teacher education are prepared to train teachers to be effective under the Common Core standards?
I have the belief that this is new for everyone, and there are no centers of immediate expertise, but there are individuals with expertise, and most likely those are residing inside the classrooms at the moment. And so, once again, a great opportunity to build that confidence very quickly if we could do this one together. So, do I think that this is ready for me tomorrow? No. I have confidence that our institutions of education learn and can learn quickly.
Can I just say, some of the faculty at the great math education organizations played a beautiful role in the development of the Common Core. Let's remember that the productive relationship between high-quality researchers and design is one of the real breakthroughs of the Common Core, was bringing together evidence. So I think that all of us fear that trying to change quality institution by institution is daunting, to put it mildly. But why don't we look at Common Core? Why don't we look at teams of talented people perhaps in a way the College Board does in some of its work, sharing high-quality courses that are designed and built upon and refined through excellent educators working together.
So let's
and
draw a finer
creating-
point to
Yeah.
your point, because I want to actually separate these two for a second. I couldn't agree with you more that brilliant minds at the Academy helped shape
Yeah.
the Common Core. I think the question I want to drill a little bit further on is teaching inside the Common Core,
Exactly.
as opposed to the construction
Yeah.
of the key
I
standards.
totally agree with you. And I just think also, just to say it, it was a combination of mathematicians and math educators. So if you're really going to make terrific courses, it's the mathematicians as well as the people in the ed schools.
But practically speaking, though, right, we've got 1,400 teacher prep programs, give or take, across the country. Many of them not at the kinds of institutions from which folks are recruited. No, I mean, there's a lot of institutions involved here. You know, we have a poor track record
Yep.
going back decades of trying to get these preparation programs to voluntarily
Yep.
overhaul what they do. I understand the value of trying to share practices, but I guess I'm curious, are there other levers, are there other supports, are there other ways to help change what's going on if that's going to be an important piece of
Let
the
me
puzzle?
pause and celebrate your candor in the following sense. When Rick says out loud, in an uncomfortable way, that 90% of professional development spending, when evaluated, does not get us very far, this is the time, in a time of limited resources, to step out into fresh candor. When people ask, what more resources do we need to implement the Common Core, it worries me as a question in the sense that, folks, we gotta learn how to redirect and be more efficient and take advantage of the fewer things these standards are actually asking us to do. And so I just am saying, Rick, you are right, that as a system, producing productive adult growth, that is, moving on to the phrase professional development, to people growing, I think that probably all of us share the instinct that the review of student work, there's some emergent data that teachers getting to that level of detail in common seems more productive. The second body of evidence that's beginning to emerge is when teachers learn to do something in the context of a specific course rather than generically teaching. Some of our AP data is encouraging that kind of immersion in, let's say, chemistry or particular mathematics may you more. It seems that people tend to learn through the work they do rather than separate for it. One problem with professional development is it's by teaching fewer things in math and work. You know, in China, teachers are doing professional development as they teach each day and discussing it. It's not this separable thing. So I just want to say what you're asking is profound. It is true in this country that we have not built these delivery systems over 40 or 50 years. The data is daunting. It would be foolish to wave that away in your face. You know what I mean? That is a next generation of reform. It's going to take candor, and you're right. You know what I mean? None of us know exactly. It is also true that teacher colleges, like many parts of our systems, are radically fragmented, and anything that is not galvanizing and powerful to bring them together will likely fail. Teacher college education reform is not a productive history, right? But the question is, to me, does the Common Core make it a little more likely? Does it make it a little more likely that we could convene and then with the right incentives, as you're describing, encourage, solicit excellence? Will the demand for excellence rise because the demands on students are rising if we work together? Let me give you a last example, Rick, and then
Answer your question. Do you think it does?
I do. Of course I do. And I'll give you another example of this. Published materials in our field have been mediocre for some time. The tools we hand teachers are a betrayal of their commitment to their own children. But all the largest school districts in America lined up behind the publisher's criteria in English language arts and mathematics to stand together to insist that those materials must improve. That helps the publishers and it helps kids.
Okay.
Similarly, for teacher education,
David.
we could do the same thing.
Okay, so Liz, let's David just made the point about published materials, and this is obviously something that's long been frustrating for districts, trying to sort the wheat from the chaff. Currently, I think there's somewhere north of 25,000 titles on Amazon that are promote themselves as aligned to the Common Core in various ways. How does your team figure out which of these really are aligned and which of these actually are going to work in this new environment?
Well, we're taking a little bit different approach because we're trying to go to a more teacher-centered approach where teachers actually build units backwards, starting with the outcomes, of course, and then aligning assessments and then creating strategies and then choosing resources that meet their needs in that unit. And so we're trying to move away from sort of the big book that we all had on our desk, and we all read the various little snippets of different pieces of literature, and instead go toward actually the notion that David keeps referencing, and that is less is more, and choose the most the meatiest of materials and allow students to explore deeply. And that one parent said to me recently, I don't understand why the written question was about butterflies. If it had been about BMX bikes, my son would have done much better. And so one of the things we're encouraging teachers to do is to really think about, is your vehicle for the learning of these skills really the only way to learn it, or could students have some choice? And we think greater student autonomy and maybe a menu of options for materials to students even would probably and likely yield better results, given all of the recent information we have on student motivation and the fact that students today have to see this as meaningful and relevant to their lives in order to have the level of engagement that we want, the long-term learning that ends up being sustainable and brings down remediation rates. So we're trying to move away from district-wide adoptions and instead empower teachers and teams of teachers who are working together in a particular grade level or content area to purchase the things that they feel are most relevant to their students and the way that they're going to approach these outcomes that we're asking from them.
This is raising a very interesting skill set that I think is sitting in front of us, that we're watching kind of like in live time. And all of this conversation is emerging in our need and ability to help facilitate persistence and grit, both with our teachers and with our students. And we just haven't focused on that as a skill set. We focus actually maybe on just the opposite, and that is a quick surf across items, and you didn't get it, so then you go to remediation. But this notion of persistence and grit is finding its way very publicly right now through both from professional development to the ability to persist in complex, ill-defined tasks and in fewer, much more deepful and much more meaningful pieces of text and problem solving. And I wanted to link that piece back to the teacher preparation piece, because that is a skill set that we actually need to get our hands around pretty quickly. We could have a conversation about the research around that, and we could talk about Carol Dweck, and we could talk about Duckworth, but it is absolutely finding its place dead center in how we're approaching this work. And so support around that is kind of missing at the moment. So we're getting support around content, but not necessarily published support around those types of skills.
What would that entail?
Right now, we're trying to find out how we coach students and faculty to persist and to develop the skill set that simple getting it is not going to help you in the Common Core. I mean, there is this notion of persistence in understanding, persistence in comprehension, and persistence in moving through what traditionally we saw as didn't get it, first time failure. That is not actually has its place in the development of student achievement in the Common Core. And that is a very different notion of skill set. I think we have to say this at a 50,000 foot level. You didn't get it, we can give you to someone else for remediation or some other program, to that's not exactly how it's going to work in the classroom whatsoever anymore. That this is an area that affects the home-school relationship. It's an area that affects the cross-teaching relationship, and absolutely the student-to-student learning relationship.
So, Eric, at least in the near term, and John, I don't know if I'm actually hearing you correctly, so correct me if I'm not, but one thing this implies is an emphasis on skills that we don't necessarily assess right now and that don't factor into our discussion. So, Eric, in the short term, for instance, Eric, I understand that in Durham you wanted to start doing some assessments that were more aligned to the Common Core, at least in the interim, but you, for various reasons related to, I believe, the state's race to the top applicant, that it didn't make sense to try to discontinue some of the other assessments. So we wind up actually, at least in this bridge period, with districts having to do more assessments than they've historically done. Mm-hmm. Given we know some of the concerns among parents and educators about the amount of testing, how does one play this through in a leadership role? How do you reassure parents that this makes sense? How do you work with educators? And how do you make yourself comfortable that we're not testing too much?
All right. Well, I think there's several things you do. One, first, you make sure that you communicate very, very well. One of the pieces that I have not heard, and I would say that I think we would be remiss if we didn't, is the role of parents in this, because I think they play a critical role as well. So several things that we've done this year is that we've already started educating parents and having parent sessions on the Common Core. What does that mean? We've also talked about the state.
What does that entail? Are those school-based, or those, how do y'all do this?
It's basically district-wide. We offer it district-wide, but we also encourage our schools to offer those sessions as well. And what we actually do is work through with parents examples of things that your children will be exploring, how it will impact your child, what are some things that you can do at home to help support what we're doing at the school level. So those are some of the things that we've actually done to bring them along with us. We've also talked to our Chamber of Commerce and the business community to make sure that they understand what this shift means and what we will actually be doing. So what we're trying to do is bring our community along as we make these changes. Now, it's ironic that our strategic plan, our district strategic plan, states that we will decrease the number of tests or assessments that we want to provide, but obviously we're going to be doing the opposite during this interim period. So what we've been trying to do is explain to people the why behind it. But as we make this transition, I think a lot of folks are beginning to understand, not that they agree, but they understand that the approach that we're taking, because we're trying to move slow in order to move fast a little bit later. So that's the approach that we've taken, and we're also just trying to educate our community.
Well, we've taken a slightly different approach in that a lot of these tasks that we're moving toward are more rigorous and in-depth and require sort of performance assessments. And sometimes really well-done performance assessments don't actually feel like testing and shouldn't feel like testing. And so one of the ways that perhaps we're doing more assessment, but actually we're looking at assessment more like learning, and some of the things that we're asking students to do, they wouldn't probably, if you asked them if they're walking down the hall, did you just have a test, they would say no. But for us, we recognize that we're measuring their abilities and skills, their knowledge, and all of these things while they're working on these projects or products. And so I think that the whole, vision of assessment is sort of in transition to, or should be, and we're moving away from what feels like a more traditional testing to more authentic and rich assessments that measure these more rigorous skills in a better way anyway.
Now, Joanne, one of the questions it raises, of course, especially in the conversation around No Child Left Behind or ESEA, is as we move to more sophisticated, nuanced assessments, it's harder necessarily to get clear readings on whether children have obviously and objectively mastered basic skills.
Why do you say that?
Oh, because I think when we're talking about assessing several million children in a large state, there are questions about whether the inter-rater reliability of those assessments is as clear-cut as multiple choice assessments. There are questions about whether some teachers have less rigorous standards than colleagues. So I mean, certainly push back if you like, but I'm also wondering, particularly from the perspective of, say, civil rights organizations that see No Child Left Behind styled assessment as a safeguard against some schools or some systems turning a blind eye or simply passing the buck on the worst off kids, wondering how do we create room for the kind of assessment that Liz just talked about without retreating from what some folks see as a crucial safeguard?
So I think one thing that's important to keep in mind across all the discussions that we've been having is we are at the cusp of a whole new way of doing schooling, and we're in the micro infancy of this. So we are going to be learning so much, and I bet even 5 years from now we're going to be shocked at what all of this looks like compared to what the picture in our heads is right now. And there's so many conditions in place that are going to make innovation happen in this field in a very, very different way, I think, going forward than it has for the past 100 years. And it starts with the common part of Common Core and technology, which we keep alluding to but not really talking about. As you're listening to the discussions about what classrooms are looking like, you're not really hearing yet what the technology piece is going to look like, and that has to do with teacher preparation as well as assessment as well as day-to-day instruction. So I just think a lot of this is going to be shifting out from under us. And the goal that we have to have for education is to create a continuous improvement system out there. So we have to understand how things are working and then start tweaking, fixing, adapting as we have better tools and more knowledge and understanding. I think these assessments have different purposes, and assessments that teachers are giving every day to understand, did the kid learn what I think I just taught, is a different thing than the accountability structure at the end of the day to make sure that schools are treating all of their students fairly, that their students with disabilities are getting access to the same high rigorous standards that their affluent kids in their suburban schools are. All these things are important, and there's different tools to answer different questions. We're just going to have to be smart and nimble because we don't know all the answers to this right now.
I would say a couple of things about this because systems like ours we have to lead this, and there's a part that's unknown at the moment. So we hope we're doing it right. I mean, I think we are. But there's a couple of fundamental shifts, and I think at the moment we are underestimating the ease with which the Common Core is going to allow this transition. So there's the notion of a much greater and much more elegant form of assessment that is not about a discrete piece of knowledge. And the transition between these assessments coming in and the ones we have now is, you're right, I fall down very much along the lines that I want to be very careful that we move away from being responsible and accountable for the progress of subgroups of students, which I would argue No Child Left Behind has been very clear and I would argue very, very important in doing that. But we're going to move to fewer pieces of content. The whole conversation began around that, which would automatically say that for that type of assessment, you actually have a leaner, a meaner, thinner form of assessment that can be done less frequently to actually accomplish that. At the same time, you have an introduction of another type of assessment, which is going to allow us to capture things like application and implication, inference, the types of skill sets that are going to come with the use of the Common Core. So I think our worries about that piece are solvable. There are implications to this transition, however, which affect individual teacher evaluations, school accountability, and I want to lay out two of those implications. I think that for students and for adults, we are going to need to get our hands around the ability for collective responsibility and accountability and individual simultaneously. We just, in LA
Practically
right now...
speaking, what's that mean? So that means...
Yeah, I'm going to say in LA right now we're voting on the new evaluation system. I mean, we got an agreement with our teachers, albeit a difficult one to hammer out, for those of you who tend to follow those things. But it occurred, and it occurred in a way that I am very, very proud of, and that there is collective and individual. So there is school-wide accountability that every teacher shares, as well as individual accountability. In other words, school-wide results are for everybody. Because the Common Core is impossible to be nailed down, I think, as David elegantly said, this notion of literature is not based in the English classroom alone any longer. So that a teacher's accountability on the basket has to do with student achievement is both collective and individual. And second of all is we're facing that with students. Students are moving very, very quickly away from a single piece of sole authorship to collective product. And how we actually get our hands around collectively developed product and how we wrestle with scoring that is happening in real time, and we've got to get our hands around that piece as well. And I think those are pretty big implications. There are implications for assessment systems, there are implications for accountability systems and evaluation systems.
Just to make this very plain, John, so one question is, as we move to the Common Core assessment in California in a couple of years, you're going to have teachers, presumably under your new assessment, under your new teacher evaluation system. Their growth is going to be a component of this.
Correct.
And that's going to be growth that's going to migrate from one assessment system to another. And there will be presumably concerns about statistical properties of these assessments, whether that's a fair measure of teachers. How are you guys, much like Eric was discussing, trying to make this difficult transition from what Joanne characterized as one era to the next? How are you guys going to make that transition without the thing blowing up on you?
We've thought a lot about the piece, and by no means do we claim that this is the answer. It just is the way we're tackling it at the moment. By having a framework that is not singularly test-based. Very, very important to us around this. A framework that involves both the collective set of measures and an individual set of measures. We are all responsible for achievement in a school. We're all responsible for outcomes in a school. And I am responsible for what happens in my classroom. And by having a very thoughtful balance about the role of an individual assessment in a formula around this piece. So we argue that the lion's share, the majority, whether it be 51% or 75%, that number is less important than making sure that the majority is a good clinical observation by multiple observers of practice in the classroom. And that when it comes to putting in the assessments, we already know that the structure of either PARC or Smarter Balance is that they are able to handle growth over time around that piece, but that it be classroom-based and school-based at the same time. That's what we've attempted to do. Now, in 2 years, we can tell you how well or how poorly that went, but we think that the structure around balance of collective and individual and that migration from one form of assessment to another was thought through in launching it.
Hey, John, the only thing that I would add to that is having been in Guilford County and now in Durham, we've implemented incentive-based systems like that in both of those districts where you look at collective and individual. And what we found is that there's more buy-in with everyone in the school because we're all working toward a common goal. Although I may be responsible for ELA, you're also a counselor down the hall or a PE teacher, but you also have a role in making sure that that child is successful as well. So that's what we found, and that it did work.
Exactly. I mean, I happen to agree 100%. I also think that it is, I think Joanne's point about we're at the edge of an entirely different world means that it'll be very, very unproductive in this country if we say that the accountability and assessment systems we put in 5 and 8 years ago are either good or bad. It is about the migration of those to the orientation about where we are right now. And so holding on is the same issue that will be non-productive as opposed to improvement in migration.
You know, as I listened to our conversation over the past hour, I worry if I were a parent or observer of this, I'd be like, oh boy, this is really hard. You know, especially because Rick has this penchant for asking, well, what about this really hard problem? And then let me serve you another insolvable dilemma. So I want to breathe for a moment about beautiful simplicities. That is, if we want to talk about assessment of literacy, which seems a very big, confusing thing, let me just say this. In later literacy, if a student can read complex, demanding text and write about it clearly, if they can read like a detective and gather evidence, analyze and apply it, they are very much likely on their way to college. Likely not just single sources, often combining sources, period. Right. So imagine that a master assessment for these standards is, can you, given sources, analyze them, understand them, read them with care, gather evidence from them, write clearly. Let's just say for a moment that, and notice the return to fundamentals here. I want to be a little careful of the world changing. What I mean by that, of that talk, because what's interesting about these standards is they also return to fundamentals that are critical when anything changes. What I mean by that is reading dense, difficult text and writing about it clearly were mighty arts long ago and remain so. They still predict college readiness pretty darn well. And it could be said of our century that the technology of interruption has outpaced the technology of concentration. So we have to be careful in the leap to the new. So then what might we do about this? Then you pointed out interrelated reliability. Well, let's talk about kids. Take this example, reading carefully and writing about it. Let's talk about things like AP readers, where the AP community of teachers respect one another to check each other's work when they read something. And so if you have these essays, you can use AI as one check, but also other excellent teachers to check teacher knowledge, using technology to render that more efficient. That's a technology of community and concentration. So communities of expert teachers looking together at student work, creating an audit or check supported by breakthroughs in AI that are not good for giving specific feedback, but pretty good for holding an overall score of performance, make a lot possible, but it's not that far away. What I mean by that is the consortia exams being now developed will require kids for the first time every year to analyze source material and write about it clearly. That's work worth doing. It's doable tomorrow. And if kids can do that well, they can do lots of other things as well.
Terrific. With Actually, let's take that rest as an opportunity to open it up to the audience. I'd ask a couple of things. One, please catch Casey or Taryn's eye. When you speak, please be kind enough to identify yourself by name and affiliation. And as always, please ask a question. If we get about 15 seconds in and I don't see a question come in, we'll give somebody else a shot. Taryn?
Claudio Sanchez, National Public Radio. Can somebody talk about money? Will there be, will this be more costly, this transition? And given the state of state budgets on education, is that possibly a huge hurdle for this transition to take place?
I mean, I don't personally believe that in all instances it will be more money. I think you have to, and I think David mentioned this earlier, you have to look at some of the resources that you currently have, and in some instances you have to redirect those resources. Obviously, in our district, from a money standpoint, we are spending more money on technology because we're trying to reach a higher standard. So from that perspective, yes, but to say that Common Core in and of itself will cost you more money, I would not say that in total. But obviously there are some increases that we will incur. But again, it's looking at the resources that you have. One of the things we had to do was really help our teachers understand that some of these resources we already had. So for example, instead of buying textbooks, are we going to utilize other resources that we have to help you get what you're trying to deliver for your students?
The answer is no, it won't cost more money if I had Dave Driscoll's state budget in Massachusetts and California. But I don't. So in some places, those investments, but particularly I think around technology and professional development, appropriately need to be increased, period, around that. But I will give a personal opinion, and that is you can do that through thoughtful policy. So less prison building and more preschool building can possibly occur within the exact same state budget.
I believe you cut about $18 million last year while you were working on some of the implementation issues you talked about. Could you talk a bit about how did you make those reallocations that Eric hinted at?
That's exactly what we did. We literally went through our budget line by line, and Douglas County, while a very middle-class community, is the lowest funded district in the Denver metro area, significantly so, and received very little, if any, federal dollars for unique populations, just because we don't perhaps have those in our census data, as the numbers are in other places. So we literally went through our budget line by line and said, we have been doing this. Do we have to? How can we reallocate that? We were faced with an $18 million budget shortfall, and in addition to that, our class sizes had grown too large. Our teachers had been on pay freezes. I mean, we just had this untenable set of circumstances, but we were dedicated to figuring it out, and so we reduced class size. We cut the $18 million. We actually, took care of the costs going forward, gave a raise, and did all of those things by reallocating a lot of the dollars. But I agree that.
So where did the money come out? What's an example or two of where you found large sums to make this work?
We had some things that were more challenging in some of our contracts that we did eliminate. We had a severance program, just as an example, that we were paying people who were leaving the district about $40,000 a year, and we reallocated that $2.5 million annual line item to the teachers that were going to continue to be in the district and work with our students. Because there are things that you do in the past when your budgets are different that as you move forward, you really have to start to rethink, are those things that we should continue to do going forward? And at the same time, we had to, obviously put together a phase-out plan because there were people that were depending on certain things that we had done historically. But that's just one example. There were other things that we had in our contracts, or approaches we had taken to budgeting for utilities that we changed. The way we changed some of the things at our medical fund. We just did different things to be more efficient and have a little bit more flexibility in our budget so that we could get where we wanted to go.
Casey?
Can I say one?
Oh, Dave.
Rick, I'm torn on this subject because I think first as a society we should understand a very brave thing has happened. Educators throughout this country have raised their hands for much more demanding standards for their kids, including teachers. And it's very threatening to them in a way, and they know it. That is, we know when scores come out in 2014-15, they will likely drop, and many of my colleagues here on this panel will be called incompetent and stupid. And in fact, they are being candid and telling the truth. In fact, those scores will only reveal the truth, that kids today are not really on the path to college readiness, as our College Board data shows. and and by telling the truth, no good deed goes unpunished, as we all know. And so I do think, as a community, it is time to rally behind this candor and courage and prepare the public for a drop that is a statement of candor, not of incompetence, to consider smart investments to support people who are making brave choices and help them do their work. This is a time for our society to reinvest in this work. At the same time, as you can tell by my comments, I'm equally frank that mediocre and crappy stuff is just as expensive often as excellent stuff, that we have to bind together as a community to demand higher standards in the things we purchase, and that's costless and powerful, that some excellent stuff will be free, and their distribution is our problem. Can we build those networks? So can we be equally humane about investing and standing behind people, and also tough-minded enough to admit that a lot of what we've invested in, as you've said, Rick, so forcefully, creates almost no return for children? And is there a kind of dual candor here that's possible?
Hi, I'm Michael Zinstein with Education Writers Association. My question is about the sort of wraparound efforts involved in getting students up to speed. So we've involved parents in the discussion. We've involved, state and federal leaders in the discussion on how to improve student achievement. But is there an element in Common Core, or is there a will to accompany Common Core with the sort of extended learning, summer school, additional injection of extra time into the curriculum that that tests suggest improve students' competency in the scores? So is that something on the horizon?
So I think it's more than the will. It's going to be an absolute need to do that. I mean, it comes with the rethinking of how we work with students, and the traditional notions of the finite period and finite school day are definitely going to change. And technology is already moving that very, very quickly for us. So their technology is our friend. Just a personal belief word around the waivers as I'm watching the federal government support states in doing that. That is absolutely providing resources back to districts to do exactly what you just said around that. And I think that those are that's a partnership opportunity that's very much needed and very much being directed along the lines of what you suggested, and that is, how do we think opportunities for students who come at this at a variety of places of current competence. How do you move a whole group of students? And that's going to look different than just company A coming in and doing remediation, for 25 minutes after school.
Thank you. Hi, Betsy Brand with the American Youth Policy Forum. My question is actually building on that, but going a little bit further, and it builds on some of the ideas of really breaking the system and doing things very differently. A lot of the students who are behind will need not just extra learning time, but to have 4 years perhaps. So how are the superintendents in particular thinking about competency-based education that uses perhaps 5 years or even 6 years, particularly for students who are over age and under credit and are going to have a very difficult time meeting these new higher
We're definitely looking at competency-based instruction, even in sort of what has been traditionally, if you have to repeat the whole course if you fail it, this kind of thing. So there's a lot of interest in looking at what are the key outcomes of this course, what part of the unit did the student pass, what part of the unit did the student fail, how can we approach that remediation piece differently, and move away from this notion of seat time being the answer, because we don't believe that it is. And so the online world has sort of opened that door pretty wide and has allowed us and really brought the public sentiment around to that, thinking that it's all about demonstrating your abilities, not about sitting in a desk. And so we're moving in that direction both through online programs, but also, sort of the in-person programs also, just getting away from seat time and moving toward competency.
Two implications for that I think you're going to see very quickly. One is the accountability systems about what school completion or middle school completion looks like is going to shift, and I am very glad to endorse that away from a number of years to the delivery of competent product and being able to do that. Or said another way, cohort-based graduation is, I think, a bit of an enemy to helping students get there. That doesn't mean there should be a movement away from the accountability of completion. It's the year attached to that. And the second thing is, I think you're going to be hosting a forum in 5 years about the whole construction of the high school diploma, but in particular the course of credits. I think that schools will no longer own the monopoly on that. Students are walking in now with online courses from Stanford and Yale that are done and I want to apply this to my transcript. And the idea that while you question very appropriately so focus on students who are struggling, students are advancing in faster and more amazing ways than we ever thought before. And that balance, I think, is a very unique opportunity to help one and the other.
Man, I guess one thing this brings to mind for me is as we think, 2 years out and either Congress moves on reauthorization of ESEA or we're talking about another round of waivers, which seems more likely from where I stand. If we talk about some of these seismic shifts and what school looks like and accountability, does that mean that it would be incumbent on the administration to maybe talk to states about letting them move in directions that are simply, that were unimaginable under the architecture of NCLB?
Yes. No, I think that is the nature of a continuous improvement system. What we have today is not locked in, so we're about to get, a new round of assessments. I think we need to look at them as version 1.0, not as the final end word. Like the standards are even new. We'll be improving the standards over time. Like this is the way we need to be looking at these things.
And I think it's worth just saying out loud, because I've known Joanne and other people on this panel for years, that I do want to credit NCLB and, perhaps unpopularly stand for it as insisting on a new level of vigilance about all kids and defending an equity agenda that was in great peril before it did it. And I just want to say, as sunny as I am about the Common Core, to presume equity will follow, that there will not be inequalities, that without vigilance, letting schools kind of do their own thing can be quite hazardous to certain kinds of kids, and that we have real hard thinking to do about how to guarantee acceleration. I'm just saying, we may not have said that in a clear enough voice as part of our discussion, but flexibility does not mean a diminution of vigilance about some kids and the unfortunate things that
flexibility is
happen.
not pass on having to deliver for every child. If anything, we can move from subgroups to a more personalized view where every single child gets what they need.
David, one concern that some skeptics of the Common Core have raised is they said, talk of continuous improvement is admirable, but they're concerned that when you establish a set of standards, that it tends to be the lethargy sets in over time, intentionally or no, and it becomes increasingly difficult to make the kinds of adjustments and improvements that a 1.0 demands. What do you say to bring comfort to these folks?
First thing is this. What's cool about the standards is, unlike the phone book that was typical state standards, they're slim. Let's remember that, because that allows for a much slimmer platform to share ideas. And then the second thing I'd say is evidence matters. Revision is not like a faddish. There's overwhelming evidence that the core mathematics in these standards predicts every future of mathematical success. If we're going to change that math, we better learn something new. The notion that reading texts of increasing complexity predicts your success in college and career, including technical subjects, by the way, is overwhelming. It is unlikely until that evidence shifts, the standards should shift that emphasis. So evidence first as a propositional revision, and also please remember the eraser as well as the pen. If we are going to revise these standards, take away, teachers don't get more time, and kids don't get more time. So that's the elegance we have to insist upon.
Case?
My name's Corey Reed. I'm a parent of 4, and to the extent that it matters, a supporter of the Common Core. So my question is twofold, and it's for the practitioners on the panel. What what resources are being dedicated to and tools provided around teachers being able to learn the Common Core and reference the Common Core in their daily instruction activity? And two, what resources and tools are being provided for those teachers to monitor performance against those standards individually and collectively with the students on a daily basis?
In my particular school district, we have like I mentioned earlier, we've embedded the Common Core in a new curriculum that our teachers are actually developing, and then we align that to a new teacher evaluation instrument so that we're not asking them to teach something new and different, but evaluating them on yesterday. And so we've intentionally aligned what we're asking from them with the curriculum that they have written that is, in our view, kind of goes above and beyond even what the Common Core asks. And then from there, we've also, paid attention to the professional development piece in that the whole notion of drive-by PD doesn't work, where you just go out and everybody sits together and we do something, then you go back to your classroom and do exactly what you did yesterday. And so instead, differentiated professional development that actually is presented in lots of different modes and attempts to model the kind of classroom and instructional experience that we want our students to have. So we want our teachers to not only be learning how to teach differently and what to teach differently, but experience it also in their own professional development opportunities. So we've realigned our resources that we've historically used to do other things to do that instead.
Liz, and would this have been impractical prior to the Common Core, or is it easier under the Common Core, or is this something that the Common Core doesn't really directly impact, but it's a technique for trying to help teachers teach the Common Core?
So I don't think that the Common Core actually is the catalyst. I just think that as we reimagine what education needs to do for students, and everything that is connected to that, it just makes sense for us to model that with our teachers, because we're asking them to do something they frankly weren't trained to do. And so it's unfair to put out this new evaluation instrument that's very rigorous, very specific. The state of Colorado requires next fall that 50% of the evaluation be based on student growth and achievement data and new standards. And so to do all of that, I think the only way you can do it when people weren't prepared for that is to really redesign the professional development world and say, if we're going to ask you to do this, then we need to do it first, and we need to show what it looks like and demonstrate it for teachers.
Very similar in Los Angeles, a new entire system built on the skill sets to teach inside the Common Core, almost a complete rehaul of how we're doing professional development, focused on this across the groups of students that we have the greatest challenges with in Los Angeles. Two things that have emerged that I think are worthy of note. One of those is that professional development was probably concentrated first at the core of principals, so that their entire fundamental obligation has moved from running school to improving teaching and learning inside of school. It can't get better unless someone can help me, coach me, get better around that piece. And there's a big knowledge base that was being built around that. And second of all is the work of teachers' professional development, very public and very wiki-like. So as teachers are creating lessons and then trying those lessons out, they're public for all of us to see. I get to see you do that. I get to actually build upon that piece. So this notion that there's a publicness to the growth is clearly stated because we expect students to do that every single day. And one is you really just can't get better in private. And making that as free as possible from early judgment so that you create an environment around learning.
Hi, my name is David Sherman from the American Federation of Teachers. And I want to say that the American Federation of Teachers, as was mentioned, was very involved in the development of the Common Core, not we as an organization, but rather hundreds of our teachers from around the country. And we support it unequivocally with every fiber of our being. And we want to see it work. But we're very, very nervous, frankly, okay? And we're mainly nervous because what we're hearing from all over the country, with a few exceptions, is that teachers just aren't being prepared. They're not being given the opportunity, the right kinds of professional development. They're being, we have 3 days, we have, this drive-by workshop and everything. But teachers and, frankly, parents, and I'm glad that you mentioned the role of parents, are just not being prepared. I do have a question. But since there's no teacher voice here, I'm going to take a minute if you don't mind. Just a minute. Okay. And the fact of the matter is that teachers are very supportive of the Common Core. Teachers all across the country, but they want the help so that they can do it the right way, and they're just not getting it. The federal government put in $350 million for assessments, nothing for curriculum. I know you can't do curriculum. Nothing for professional development, nothing for anything else, okay? States across the country are talking about what they're doing, but they're not doing much. You look at all of this. The fact of the matter is...
Okay, so the question is, Dave.
The question is, what can we do now to make sure that we get the rollout of the Common Core on the right track so we don't see history repeat itself and have a failing standards movement?
So
Terrific.
Two thoughts. One is, couldn't agree with you more. I actually think that point is right on. This is a golden moment for a transformation for both sides on this issue. If you could help us create new structures to allow those things to take place and hold us accountable for providing that professional development, I think that would be a breakthrough moment a lot. So we currently are trying to do this inside of traditional ossified structures. X number of minutes in contracts allowed for professional development, and you pay X price to get that done. Whereas it becomes a fascinating moment to rethink completely how to honor the teaching profession. And both actually could be a huge lead in that piece. And then the second point is,
So, John, just to
yeah.
make sure I understand you there. So you're suggesting, for instance, that contractual restrictions on minutes of professional development per day or per year or what have you, are getting in the way from your perspective of trying to provide the support?
We're trying to do a process for which contracts were not designed to let happen. It's just completely apples and oranges. And so it's not that the former contract language is good, bad, or indifferent. It's just not working for this. So, but both sides, people are really afraid to make these changes, and I totally get it around that. What would be worse is more bad professional development. So, you create the opportunity for a very different structure, and it's just as crappy as the first stuff. That would be terrible around that and very disrespectful. So the notion of side-by-side development of a new vehicle and the content of that vehicle, and I would argue being teacher-driven around that, is going to be real helpful. And then the second piece is, I think it's our teachers who are going to lead this conversation with parents, much more so than the system around that, and providing ways to elevate leadership for teachers in that place would be a huge piece.
One of the things that I'll state, in a non-unionized state like North Carolina, we have had challenges with getting teachers, not all of them, some of them, to just participate in the professional development because there's the piece of, well, I only work from this time to this time. However, we've had other teachers who have said, hey, I'm going to take this on, I want to understand it, I want to learn it, and I want to move it forward. So I think the bag is a little mixed, but I think what we're trying to do is provide opportunities for teachers to learn this. But I'll also say this to you, in an urban district with no low-performing schools, we have teachers who are saying, we've made the bar, we've met the challenge, we want to stay there, so tell us what we need to do, and those teachers rise to the occasion. So I think it's helping everybody move along and say, hey, here are opportunities for you to participate in professional learning. We're going to make them available to you. Come to them and participate. But I think my view is a little different than a unionized state where you have a contract that is somewhat binding.
One question I want to just throw out real quick is, all three of the superintendents, you talked about, very thoughtful efforts to make professional development pay off in this case. On the other hand, it does strike me that you hardly ever talk to superintendents or board members who tell you, yeah, we're doing dumb and lousy professional development. Almost everybody claims that they have rethought it, that they're finally doing it well. And yet you hear from teachers that, no, actually it's the same lousy, ineffectual stuff. So it seems to be somewhere in here there's often a disjuncture, and I don't know how we get our hands around that going forward.
Well, I think someone talked about continuous improvement, and I think you asked folks, hey, is this working, is it not working? One of the things I tell my staff all the time is, rather than us develop the professional development in the central office, ask the teachers what they need, let them develop it, and that's what we did in our training for the last 2 summers. We sent out a call for proposals to teachers, and we said, hey, if we're going to have a training on Common Core, you guys send us proposals. This is what you want to do. Fine. We vetted it. We made sure that it worked, and so the teachers were the ones who were providing the professional development. That's just one way.
Okay, we'll wait for one more question, Case.
Hi, Alice Kane with Teach Plus. My question is about Common Core and teacher retention, particularly retention of excellent, effective teachers. The reason I ask, Teach Plus in recent months our teachers have hosted conferences on Common Core by teachers for teachers around the country. We've had about 2,000 participate so far, thousands more on wait lists. And what we're seeing over and over is that the more teachers engage with Common Core, the more they like it. And teachers are saying things like, I had one foot out the door, this is what I got into teaching for, now I want to stay. And so we're seeing that over and over. My question is, what are the are you thinking about it this way? And what are the implications, including budgetary implications, if Common Core has perhaps an unintended consequence of improving highly effective, excellent teachers?
You know, some of the problems, David, that you were talking about are legend and old. That is, when have we had a rollout across a state, a school district, where we have not all mourned that really galvanizing throughout classrooms, individual teachers on a large scale has been so darn hard. And often a lot of goodwill involved in it, and then perhaps a little bit of self-evasion when you think that you're trying something so much better, but it's not quite good enough. This is a hard problem, let's confess it. So let's also look at what Alice began to talk about, which is what is fresh and new? What are the technologies that are emerging that we actually, without BSing each other, believe have promise? And I think it's stuff like Share My Lesson. I think it's exactly what Alice talked about, which is exceptional teachers can now share their work as a way they never could before across exceptional teachers around this country. If you look at achievethecore.org, which is always free. This is a former nonprofit I was involved in, but it will never sell you anything, but it has work for teachers, by teachers, the Core Task Project in Nevada. I think the interesting moment here is, can we invest, Alice, as you're talking about from a budgetary perspective, in engaging lead teachers in making stuff that is truly shared and doesn't remain in islands, and share it in a more systematic and productive way, so that your teachers are making stuff on their own, but frankly, they're not just their own. They're in a much more lively community. Well, yours is extremely lively, but you know what I mean, where there's a great teacher in Florida who's figured something out, and there's a kind of liveliness to this. And there is, Alice, your story is so interesting because I think those teachers are returning to their work because A, the Common Core dares to focus on work they think makes sense, for God's sakes, and B, they have a chance to have a wider impact. They have a chance to affect their practice and others. And so I do think this is extremely hard. There's reason for anxiety. What it forces us to do is to find out where's the most promise and reinvest in it, in teacher-led, high-quality work.
Okay. David, we're going to go ahead and make that the last word. I'd like to thank the Sequoia Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for the support that made this event possible. I'd like to thank Allie Kimmel and my team for a terrific job putting it together. And I'd like to thank the panelists for a terrific conversation. Thank you. We'll look forward to seeing you all soon.